it allows for a format and structure that is accessible for folks who aren't trained as a YMHFA first aider, who can still use this format in order to help support, connect with youth who are in need, whether they're experiencing a crisis or perhaps are in a situation that might lead to a crisis situation. So I think, so the goal for today is really to talk about familiarizing what does this model look like, and what are some best practices that you can share with your school teams around how to use these steps. So just as a reminder, ALGEE is the acronym that we use to think about each of these steps. So A is approach. So approach, assess, and assist youth who are in need. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. Listening non-judgmentally, giving reassurance and information to that youth, and encouraging appropriate professional and other strategies of help. So self-help or informal strategies. And this model is not linear. So there are some situations in which we only use some of these strategies, like listening non-judgmentally or giving reassurance, that might help to de-escalate a situation or prevent escalation altogether. But we can use each of these and encourage school staff to use these steps as we assess a situation and connect with youth. And I think one thing to note here as well as we go through today is that, you know, as mental health professionals, you know many of these steps yourself, but we know that, you know, educators and paraprofessionals and other folks are really on the front lines as well. And so helping them to be able to identify some of these pieces can really help when we are spread so thin. So the first part of ALGEE, the A, we want to help school staff to and ourselves to be aware of assessing the situation for the type of crisis situations that youth might experience. So differentiating between types of situations that might become a crisis, as well as situations that are immediate crisis, where we need to follow a safety plan or an intervention plan that we have already in place with our schools. Right, so we might talk with our school staff about being aware of whether a student has severe anxiety or is prone to panic attacks. Maybe there are youth that are have a more challenging time with emotion regulation and tend to escalate to more aggressive behaviors. Students we know who have experienced traumatic events or life stressors or big life changes are also at risk for escalating to a crisis situation when something arises. And then also for students who might be misusing substances. So familiarizing school staff with these are types of things to just keep an eye and ear out for. When we are thinking about immediate crisis situations, we're reminding our school staff that these are situations in which youth might be at immediate risk for hurting themselves or hurting others. So it might be that they learn of suicidal thoughts or behaviors that a student is having, or non-suicidal self-injurious behavior. We also think about these crisis situations as being related to more severe, perhaps psychotic states or severe effects of using substances. And then, as I mentioned, kind of aggressive behaviors moving to a level where they're at risk of hurting themselves or hurting others. And of course, those are times where we can remind staff about certain de-escalation strategies, but we're also, that we'll talk a little bit about today, and Linda will follow up with in more detail next week or 3 weeks from now. But we want to help school staff to be aware of those situations so that they can follow school protocol or follow general best practices for de-escalation. So in addition to assessing a situation, we also want to encourage school staff to think about what are some just best practices for approaching and assisting a youth that might, especially for situations that may become a crisis, but they're not in a crisis yet. Right, so these are things like reminding school staff to talk privately about concerns that you might have with that student rather than in a larger group calling them out. You know, why do you have your head down? Why are you late for class again, right? But if we have those concerns, pulling them aside and talking privately, and helping that school staff be aware that they might not open up to you, right? Unless they really know that you're a safe person. Also recognizing that a student might downplay what they're going through because they don't want to make somebody else upset. and letting the student know that we're here and we're ready, and there's no pressure to talk, but we are here and we care about you for when you do want to share. And right, the goal is not for school staff to completely become a trained mental health professional, but they are already on the front lines and they're hearing these kinds of things. And so if we can give some best practices about how to help youth to be able to feel comfortable to share something, and then we can connect them with the appropriate services. Okay, so the A we just went through. The L is listening non-judgmentally. So after we've assessed a situation, we've perhaps approached a youth, we want to encourage our school teams to listen non-judgmentally. And that can sound pretty obvious, but it can be very hard for folks to do, right? And so, there are some really good best practices that we can share and remind school teams around. So listening non-judgmentally, some basic things we want to encourage are allowing students to express their thoughts without interruption, which can be really hard to do when we think we might know what's best and we want to jump in. But letting them talk without interruption, asking some questions when appropriate, but without pushing them if the student doesn't want to talk, right? Using I statements to share what you've observed. So, I see that you've been late for class a lot. I'm concerned about this and I would love to know more how I can support you. Remembering that it's really about the student rather than that staff member. And that can be really hard. We often take things very personally with how a student is acting or why a student's acting a certain way. And so, I think something we constantly are trying to remind our teachers and paraprofessionals and coaches is that, it's often about that student and what's going on with them. And we want to be there to support them. It's not about us and what they're kind of doing to us, right? We have that constant thing in our head of it's, what's happened to the student, not what's wrong with the student. And then reminding them that when we listen non-judgmentally, silence can also be powerful, bless you, and can help to prevent escalation. And then nonverbal cues, which again, we'll talk more about, Linda will talk about next time as well, but nonverbal cues of eye contact, nodding, showing that you're listening and that you care. And aligned with this, I think it's also important to note that we want school staff to check in with themselves and we want to check in with ourselves as well, right? Am I in a place where I can listen non-judgmentally? Am I in a place where I can help when a situation seems to be escalating? Can I listen? Am I in an emotional state and do I have the capacity to do this? Or do I really need to try to find someone else around as quickly as possible because I'm not the best person for this and I might escalate things to the next level. So just because you're the one there doesn't mean you should stay there. We always want to think about what are cultural considerations for students from many different backgrounds. So respecting the student's experience, not making assumptions about what the student might want or need in that situation. Really being mindful of the language that we're using and the expressions. We know that's incredibly powerful. Recognizing that there might be things that get in the way for that youth or for that family to get support. So whether that's stigma, whether that's logistical barriers related to the family's schedule, job, transportation, insurance, and trying to troubleshoot those. Setting aside our own beliefs. So we're trying to help school staff recognize, again, it's kind of about them. So putting aside our own beliefs and focusing on what that youth needs in order to feel heard and be connected, and really trying to withhold any of their own judgment. So the G, ALGEE. So G is giving reassurance and information. So what we're talking about here is really how can we offer, or how can we encourage school staff to also offer statements that help that student to feel reassurance and hope while also giving additional facts about their situation or supports that might be available. So, for example, I hear you, I can tell that you're having a really hard time and I am here to support you. Or there is help out there for you. And I actually just want to pause for a quick moment. I want everybody to just think about what would be one statement that's kind of a common situation for youth, what's sort of a general statement that you could share with school staff that they could say to a student that's in need that might help them feel that reassurance and give them information that there's hope? So you could just pop in the chat. So things like, right, like I can tell you're having a really hard time and you don't always have to feel this way, right? There's support out there. So go ahead and just throw in the chat any thoughts. Yes, James put in, I can tell that's frustrating. I'm sorry that happened. Yes, Megan, you're working hard and I see that. Yes, this is difficult. We can get through it. Let's figure out how to do this together. These are really good ones. You don't have to handle this alone. I'm here to help you. Thanks for sharing. That's difficult. Yeah, these are great ones. So really thinking about what's so wonderful about all those is it's not only giving that reassurance and that hope, but also I'm here for you, right? You are not alone. I'm here to help support you. I want to help understand what happened. Yes, these are excellent. Yeah, it sounds like a difficult situation. So these are perfect. I love what everybody's saying there. And I think, you know, it can sound so obvious, right? But in the moment, it can be really hard to think of those things. And so I think, you know, if we can encourage and give a couple of those to school staff for them to be able to share, having even just one or two go-to phrases can be a world of difference, right? For them to use with their students. And so I encourage you to think about ways to share out a couple of those things. I care about you. I'm here to help. You're not alone. What you're going through is hard. You don't have to always feel this way. There are trained professionals to help, and all the many things that you all shared in the chat. And you're welcome to take this slide and just print it out, right, to share with folks if you need a couple go-to. So I want to be mindful of time. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail because I know that many of you are familiar with the types of resources out here, but I want to highlight a few things that we can talk with school teams about. One is that when we're talking about crisis options, right, we think about mobile crisis team, or sometimes we do have to go to the encourage going to the emergency department. But it can be helpful to share with school staff or with families around what happens when this occurs, right? So when we call mobile crisis team, what happens? We give brief information over the phone, a time and a place is set. 2 clinicians will come to that location and assess what happens next, right? We walk through, these are the things that will happen. Or if it's an emergency department visit, first you get screened for physical health concerns, then mental health. The team will decide whether they need hospitalization or not. And also things like expect a really long wait, bring books, bring blankets, bring snacks, things like that, right? And yes, as Melissa said, these slides will be available afterward for you to download. Similarly, thinking about what are the, so this, and I forgot to mention, this is the reason why we're talking about this is because this is the E, ALGE, encourage appropriate professional help. So when in crisis, urgent but not crisis needs, walk-in clinics like Genesee Mental Health and Liberty Resources, and also helplines. And we put together a little template that you all can print. We'll share it. We'll put it on the website that has these 2 that you can laminate, cut out, put together, that you could hand out to school staff to have with the ALGEE plan and with really specific, what are the crisis call lines or options, and what are the walk-in clinics or helplines that I could share with a student. And so you can, you know, take this resource and share with your school team so you have it immediately on hand. A few other things, outpatient services, of course, when there are not urgent or immediate concerns. And one thing I want to note is that on our website, we have a wonderful resource of community resources for that's updated periodically for families and for school teams to be able to refer to. And there's a whole section on there on crisis related services. So numbers to call, as well as specific services like HBCI or the Family Crisis Services and Supports, etc. And I'm actually just going to quickly, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and I want to just show you all to remind you, orient you to where to find this. And minute or so that we've got. Okay. So just a reminder on the website, if you go to our resource hub, if you click here, actually in the for families section, there are a lot of really wonderful resources here for families, but one thing in particular is this list of community resources for youth and families. And if it's in Spanish and English, and if you click on that, this is the resource guide that I was just referring to, which has a whole bunch of outpatient behavioral health services, as well as moving into the crisis services. And then it goes on to other types of services related to substance use and health home referrals, et cetera. So I'll let you all browse that, but that's an excellent resource that I want to just make sure that you can download and share with families as well. And I know we've got about 1 minute left, so I want to just move to the last slide here, which is, let me get back here. Share my screen. Okay, so in situations, in addition to that professional help, we're also encouraging self-help and other support strategies, right? So these are situations in which maybe the youth isn't ready for professional help, but we know that they still need support. So really helping them to think about what supports are out there that might be informal supports, things like relaxation training, exercise, getting sleep and nutrition, after school clubs, youth groups, what things are in the community, sports teams. That should say that should say YMCA. I think my brain was on YMHFA, but the Y, right, has a lot of great resources, family members, etc. And just recognizing that not every student is going to be ready or willing to try self-help, but if we can encourage them to see what supports are around, that is an important first step. And then lastly, we will talk next time in much more detail about how to stay safe in a crisis situation, which is a really important component, but also how to de-escalate. So I'll put this on the website so that we have these best practice tips. Linda will go into much more detail about when to use these de-escalation strategies. So how can we encourage school teams to each step of the cycle of regulation use various strategies that might help to prevent that escalation. So I'm going to pause so that we have time for our, let me stop sharing, for our wonderful case presentation. As Melissa mentioned, our slides will go up on the website. And we have a couple of resources that we'll share on there as well. So keep an eye out for the ones that we talked about today. And I will turn it back over to Melissa for our wonderful case presentation.